Borneo, 1945. The Japanese garrison at Balikpapan had been in place for 3 years. They had fortified the coastline with the methodical precision of men who expected to hold it permanently. Concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, minefields in the water and on the beaches, artillery positioned to cover every viable landing approach. The oil infrastructure of Balikpapan was among the most strategically significant in the entire Pacific theater, and the Japanese had defended it accordingly. Allied planners looked at the defenses and produced an assessment that was honest about the cost. Storming a fortified coastline held by a determined Japanese garrison in 1945 was not a theoretical exercise. The Pacific Campaign had already demonstrated what those operations looked like at Tarawa, at Peleliu, at Iwo Jima. The arithmetic was established. Prepared defenses plus determined defenders plus amphibious assault equals casualties at a rate that senior commanders had learned to factor into their planning with the same cold precision they applied to fuel consumption. The 7th Australian Division was assigned the assault, and what they did in the weeks before the landing and in the hours of the landing itself is the story that the records show and the popular history of the Pacific War almost entirely ignores. But before Balikpapan, there was the Kokoda Track. And before the Kokoda Track, there was a decision made in Tokyo in 1942 that set in motion everything that followed. In the summer of 1942, Japanese Imperial General Headquarters decided to take Port Moresby, the last major Allied base on New Guinea, the fall of which would open northern Australia to direct threat. The plan was to cross the Owen Stanley Mountain Range via a jungle track over the mountains, a route that Japanese planners had assessed as difficult but passable. They sent approximately 13,000 soldiers to do it. What they found on the Kokoda Track was not what they had planned for. The Owen Stanley Range is not mountains in the sense that European or American soldiers understood mountains. It is a continuous wall of jungle-covered ridges, some rising to 4,000 meters, cut by rivers that flood without warning, covered in vegetation so dense that daylight at ground level is a rumor. The track itself, the only route through, was in places wide enough for one man moving sideways, mud so deep it consumed boots, insects that carried diseases that killed faster than bullets, rain that fell so hard it was physically difficult to breathe through. The Japanese sent experienced soldiers into this. They were stopped, with catastrophic losses, by Australian militiamen. Not regulars, militiamen. Part-time soldiers, most of them in their late teens and early 20s, who had been assigned to defend the track with inadequate equipment, inadequate supplies, and orders that amounted to hold as long as you can and fall back when you must, but do not let them through. The 39th Battalion, the unit that bore the initial weight of the Japanese advance on Kokoda, has been described by military historians as one of the most inexperienced units ever committed to a critical defensive operation in the history of the Australian Army. They were boys who had been in uniform for months, not years. Their weapons were old, their boots dissolved in the mud, their rations were intermittent. Several of them were so young they needed parental permission to enlist. They held the track for weeks against a force that outnumbered them by factors that military doctrine defines as unsurvivable. Not because they were tactically sophisticated, they were not. Not because they had a plan that accounted for everything, they did not. They held it because retreating meant abandoning the track, and abandoning the track meant Port Moresby fell. And Port Moresby falling meant Northern Australia was directly threatened, and that was a thing they had decided was not going to happen on their watch regardless of what the numbers said. The Japanese advance on the Kokoda Track was stopped 40 kilometers from Port Moresby. Stopped not by a counterattack or a flanking maneuver or a brilliant piece of operational planning, but by attrition, by the specific arithmetic of a jungle that killed Japanese soldiers with disease and starvation and exhaustion at a rate the Imperial Army had not calculated for, applied against an enemy that refused to stop fighting regardless of the cost. Japanese after-action assessments of the Kokoda campaign, available in the post-war translation archive, contain observations about Australian infantry that mirror, with striking consistency, the observations that German commanders made about Australians in South Africa in 1900 and in the Middle East and Pacific in the Second World War. The assessments describe an enemy that does not behave according to the doctrinal model, an enemy that counterattacks when surrounded, that holds positions that should not be holdable, that maintains unit cohesion under conditions where cohesion should have dissolved. The Japanese commanders at Kokoda were not writing about tactics. They were writing about something they could not fully categorize, a quality in the men opposing them that their military framework had no clean term for. The Australians who survived Kokoda called it mateship, a word that sounds simple and carries more weight than most military doctrines ever written. By the time the Kokoda campaign ended in late 1942, the Australian Army in New Guinea had developed a form of jungle warfare that was genuinely without parallel among Allied forces. The Americans were still learning. The British in Burma were still adapting. The Australians, through the specific brutal education of the Owen Stanley Range, had built an operational doctrine out of lived experience. Small unit tactics, navigation without landmarks, supply by air, the management of disease alongside combat, the integration of indigenous Papuan knowledge into operational planning. The fuzzy-wuzzy angels, Papuan carriers who evacuated Australian wounded along the track under conditions that made the term heroism inadequate, are part of this story in a way that the official histories have consistently underrepresented. They carried men who could not walk. They knew the track in ways that no map captured. They worked without pay beyond rations and without recognition beyond the personal gratitude of the men they saved. The record of what they did exists in the oral accounts of the soldiers who survived and the formal recognition that came, inadequately and late, from a government that took decades to fully acknowledge what those men had contributed. The doctrine the Australians built at Kokoda was the doctrine they carried to Balikpapan in 1945. By then, the 7th Division's soldiers were among the most experienced jungle warfare troops in the world. They understood the terrain, the disease environment, the specific tactical problems of amphibious assault against prepared positions, and the management of their own fear in a way that only comes from having been through something that should have killed them. On July 1, 1945, the 7th Australian Division landed at Balikpapan. The preliminary bombardment had been one of the heaviest in the Pacific Theater. Naval gunfire, airstrikes, mine-sweeping operations that had been running for days before the assault. Every preparation that the accumulated knowledge of 3 years of Pacific amphibious operations could produce had been applied to suppressing the Japanese defenses. The Australians went ashore and found that the defenses, though damaged, had not been destroyed. Japanese soldiers were still in their positions. The killing ground was still a killing ground, and the men of the 7th Division did what Australians had been doing since 1900 on Bear Rock in South Africa and since 1942 in jungle mud in New Guinea. They moved forward, section by section, position by position, using the ground the way men who have learned the ground use it, not following doctrine but reading terrain, finding the angles, applying the specific practical knowledge that transforms a tactical problem from a diagram in a manual into a solution that works in the actual physical world. Balikpapan was secured in 3 days. The oil infrastructure, the strategic objective that made the whole operation necessary, was captured largely intact. Japanese casualties were heavy. Australian casualties, though real and permanent for the families who received the telegrams, were significantly lower than Allied planners had projected for an assault of this complexity against defenses of this strength. The records show why. The gap between projected and actual casualties is the measure of what 3 years of operational learning at Kokoda and in the campaigns that followed had built in the 7th Division. Every man who did not die at Balikpapan who was projected to die there is the product of a doctrine assembled from experience. From the boys of the 39th Battalion who held the track in 1942, and the men who carried their wounded out, and the officers who wrote down what they had learned, and the units that applied it. That chain is not broken. It runs from Kokoda to Balikpapan, and it runs forward into every engagement that Australian soldiers have fought since, carrying the same institutional knowledge, the same decentralized authority, the same refusal to accept that the situation is impossible simply because someone has calculated that it should be. The Owen Stanley Range is still there. The track is still there. The names carved into the memorial at Kokoda are still there. And somewhere in the Japanese military archives, translated and catalogued and read by the historians who bother to look, is the assessment that the Japanese commanders wrote about the men who stopped them. They could not explain it then. The record explains it now.